When one talks about Pan-Africanism, particularly today, there is the tendency from the one side to romanticize Pan-Africanism, to articulate Pan-Africanism as if it were a magic wand, which, when waved, will solve all African problems, whether they are technological, commercial, political, or otherwise. Then, from another perspective, there are those who think that Pan-Africanism is merely a curiosity, one that we take refuge in order to massage our egos without more. But Pan-Africanism is serious business. It is serious business because it helps to give us a worldview of what we can do in order to give Africa and Africans a sense of direction and a sense of esteem. And Pan-Africanism must be traced to its origins. And of course, one will not go to the period prior to the interaction between Africa and other civilizations. But there was some element of Pan-Africanism. And those of you who are familiar with the works of Cheikh Anta Diop will be familiar with his very able articulation of the state of Africa before the advent of the colonizers, before the advent of slavery, classical slavery as we know it. But we must, in the nature of things, have what I call a historical cut-off point, particularly when we want to contextualize our discourse in the arena of education generally and higher education specifically. You will be familiar with the very early ideas of the great Sylvester Williams of Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean, when the whole idea of Pan-Africanism was gaining traction in the middle part of the 19th century. Fundamentally, as a reaction to the manner in which the African had been treated during slavery and the manner in which the African was being treated during colonization. And in its very embryonic stages, one begins to hear Africans talking about education as they understood it then, as one of the key avenues via which liberation understood broadly could be achieved. That ignorance was not bliss. You wanted to create an army of young men and women whose worldview was informed in a particular direction, the direction of liberating Africans, whether they were in the mother continent, in the continent of Africa, or they were in the diaspora in the Caribbean, or in Latin America, or Europe, or Australia. And you will see the series of meetings that are then held during that period. And specifically, they are iconic interactions, because when the colonizer came into the continent of Africa, education was informed by the colonizer. So that if you went to the former Portuguese colonies, there was a very deliberate effort on the part of the Portuguese to recruit a cadre of individuals who would then be taken to Lisbon to be trained and to go back, whether it was Guinea-Bissau or to Angola or Cabo Verde or to Mozambique or to Brazil, in order to serve the colonial infrastructure. And there were very few recruited in that regard. And when one is talking about education in many countries, one can actually identify them because they then became political leaders in their various countries and were involved in establishing educational institutions. You can talk about Agostinho Neto in Angola, and you will read his poems to understand how great a mind he was. You will talk about Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. You'll talk about Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. And you come to the former French colonies, the same. And there are people from La Côte d'Ivoire here. You'll know that institutions such as the Sorbonne had specific faculties that were created for the purpose of recruiting young Africans, people like Leopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. And these were individuals who were specifically identified and picked to go for what was fundamentally indoctrination. And of course, the British also did the same thing. And that is how you then understand how they were picked, whether you are talking about in countries such as Zambia, they would pick people like Kenneth David Kaunda. In Malawi, Kamuzu Hastings Banda. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. In Tanzania, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, and one would go on and on. And even if you went to the apartheid regimes in South Africa, you'll find that individuals such as Nelson Mandela were directed towards Fort Hare. And Fort Hare was deliberately designed to train young people in order to support what was fundamentally a legal regime and a political regime that was meant to perpetuate itself. If you go to Namibia, and I'm mentioning these individuals because later they become the leaders who are involved in dealing with education in Africa. You go to Namibia, Sam Nujoma did not go to school very much, but he had his stint, and Ndimba Toivo, and one can count all of them. So that the Africa that you are talking about and the education that you are talking about is an education system that was designed to undergird the colonial system. Recently, I went to Zanzibar, and a young man was taking me through the stone town of Zanzibar, and he had the most amazing interpretation. He told me, this is one of the schools that they built in order to teach Africans to think like them. Then this is one of the churches that they created so that they could teach the Africans to worship like them and to paralyze their spirituality. And this is one of the hospitals where they treated them when they were sick so that they could serve them. I thought that was ingenious. It was a correct interpretation so that whenever the African was educated, it was not by design that you should help your fellow Africans. That was coincidental. You are simply an agent and a vessel for purposes of ensuring that you serve the colonial masters. The French and the Portuguese were more blatant. And the good professor from La Côte d'Ivoire will tell you that when they took people to the parades, one of the things they would do for the Africans to say, our ancestors, the Gauls. An African saying that their ancestors were the Gauls. And it is in that context that therefore you must understand when we are talking about the establishment of education facilities across the continent of Africa, universities were informed by that. Whether it was the University of East Africa with campuses in Kampala, Makerere for medicine, the Royal Technical College in Nairobi for engineering, the University of Dar es Salaam for law. And if you came here in Ghana when they established the Achimota College, and I want you to look at the founding instruments of Achimota and why they established Achimota. And they were doing that in King's College Budo in Uganda and later in Kisubi. The whole idea was to create an African man and woman who was fundamentally an automaton, designed to serve the master, designed to serve the puppeteer. He or she was meant to be a puppet. You know, this debate begins to crystallize a lot more visibly in the United States when you are talking about Pan-Africanism. Because the United States is grappling, the black man has been released from slavery. They have been told that they would get 40 acres and 1 mule, which they never receive. They have recruited the Uncle Toms, and they are persuading the black people at that time that what you need are a set of skills. Be a good plumber. Be a good electrician. And in the United States, you begin to see a battle and two streams. Booker Taliaferro Washington, whom you will remember, and his college in Tuskegee in Alabama, who says the Negro must go to this education institution in order to be trained to have a set of skills, to conform. But there is another stream of W.E.B. Du Bois, who says education must be revolutionary. It must change your mind. It must change your thinking. We must think differently. If they have Harvard, we must have Howard. We must think differently. And at that time, a young South African is also visiting and learning in the United States of America. People never talk about him as much as they should. Pixley Kaisaka Seme. Many people don't know, but there is a book written about him as the founder of the African National Congress. Pixley Kaisaka Seme is then a student at the University of Columbia, and he delivers one of the most iconic speeches ever delivered by an African in the month of April 1906, the regeneration of Africa. And I commend it to you. He says at that time, and I paraphrase rather than quote Pixley Kaisaka Seme, that Africa must rise again. It must rise from the morass of confusion in which she finds herself. And it is not lost on me that Pixley delivers that lecture in the year 1906. And in 1912, the African National Congress is then founded in South Africa, with Pixley Kaisaka Seme and Sir Albert Luthuli as some of the leading lights, and of course, Governor Mbeki and others. They are beginning to recognize that education is important. At that time, you also see other Africans going to the United States. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, Zik of Africa, to Lincoln College in the United States of America. Kwame Nkrumah is also going to school at that time. Mwalimu Nyerere is in Edinburgh. Kamuzu Banda is also in Edinburgh. People are going. Africa is beginning to see education as something that is important. James Kwejir Agri of Africa, who later became the first black deputy principal of Achimota College and a teacher of the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah. They are taking all these individuals to Europe and America in the belief that these individuals will do their bidding. But they do not know that they are planting a seed which is going to germinate in a totally different way, and to give birth to an educational system which is going to revolutionize the continent of Africa. And you can see quite a number of Africans, even when you go to the former French colonies, you see that wave of Leopold Senghor, as I talked about, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, you see Ahmed Ben Bella, Bibo Giba. All these are individuals, Chekante Diop. All these individuals are going to that part of the world, but the colonizers do not for one moment believe that they are going to come back and be the agents of change and be the agents of revolution of education in the continent of Africa. And this is important because the spirit of Pan-Africanism is then being planted at that time. A series of meetings, as I've already indicated, are held in the Caribbean and ultimately culminating in the much more famous meeting in 1945 in Manchester in the United Kingdom, where some of the names that you can recognize are present in Manchester, where the spirit of Pan-Africanism, which is revivalism of individuals who did not go to school, want us to see education from a totally different perspective. You can see a little later people like Marcus Garvey. No formal education, but they are influenced by this spirit of Pan-Africanism when he sings, Garvey was a buffalo soldier in the heart of America. When you hear people like Fela Nicola Pokuti, much later in Nigeria, Miriam Makeba from Southern Africa, you can see the arts are being influenced by these. And ultimately, when we talk about Pan-Africanism 1945, you begin to see a people who know that in order for Africa to realize our potential, our people must begin to work together. And it's instructive. You see people like Walter Rodney from Guyana. These are academics. Ame Sessoa from Martinique. And you can see the writing at that time. After 1945, we then begin to see the agitation, both from the political front and across the continent.